Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending where you're at. Today we're going to, Alison and the team asked us to provide a seminar on invasive species management, and particularly in regard to the projects which are related to restoring valuable sites. So we're going to go ahead with that. I don't know who knows about PRISMSS, but today the session is run by the PRISMSS, which is the Pacific Regional Invasive Species Management Support Service. This is a new service which has only started in 2019, and what we're trying to do is to provide extra support to Pacific countries in areas that have had significant gaps in the past. We have got together with partners who have supported the Pacific for a long time and their specialist areas. It's currently largely supported by the New Zealand Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Global Environment Facility through a couple of projects which we have as far as PRISMSS itself. Currently, we have quite a lot of activities going on around the Pacific and all 5 of the PRISMSS programs, and the portfolio is getting bigger, which is great. Just to give you a quick introduction on what the programs are, we have one called Protect Our Islands. Our lead technical partners are Uni Ventures from Wellington and SPC. On the map there, you can see where we have current and completed Protect Our Islands activities. And on the other side of the screen, you can see the Battler Series publications which are related to this program. We also have a Predator-Free Pacific regional program which focuses on the removal of introduced mammalian predators, led by Island Conservation and BirdLife International. And again, we have 2 Battler Series which focuses on activities of that program. We also have a War on Weeds program which is focused on high priority weeds. SPREP here leads on that program, Bradley Meyer, who's based here. And we also have a Battler Series on that. That's a very important one for today. We also have a Natural Enemies, Natural Solutions program which focuses on biological control of widespread weeds, led by Manaki Whenua Landcare Research. And we also have a Battler Series guide on that. And the last one, certainly not the least, it always comes last because it includes many of the other programs, but focusing on one site rather than single activities. And I'm the current technical lead for that. And today we're going to focus largely on what's in the Battler Guide. We've got a little presentation here, which I'm going to play to save me saying it over and over again, but it's a little bit of a description of what resilient ecosystems and resilient communities is all about.
Talo Falava. I'm David Moverley, the Invasive Species Advisor for the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program. SPREP is the primary technical partner for the Resilient Ecosystems, Resilient Communities Regional Program within the PRISMSS. The program focuses on managing different types of invasive species together at the same time to protect ecological values at an important site such as a protected area. Once an invasive species arrives on an island and becomes well established, it may not be possible to eradicate or manage it successfully over the entire island. Focusing management efforts at valued sites allows us to protect species and ecosystems into the future, despite having surrounding populations of invasive species around the sites. There are several key concepts which are important for managing multiple species over sites. The site will need to be managed on an ongoing basis to keep the impacts from invasive species to a minimum. The site will require ongoing support from the local community, as there is much work to be done, and that will stretch on into the future. Technical aspects of managing multiple invasive species is achievable when best practice systems are used. This often includes the safe use of herbicides and other controlled products. Managing valued sites allows biodiversity and ecosystems to improve and maintain their integrity and increases their value to local communities and livelihoods. Thank you.
A lot of the information that you're going to hear today and a lot of resources are available on the link there. It'll take you to the invasive species management page at SPREP. including a lot of information on the PRISMSS and the programs. The Battler resource base is a significant resource that's also accessible from there. And you can find all the Battler series there and a lot of other publications and resources. It's got information about some of the current projects we have and also some of the networks which we coordinate, such as the Pacific Invasive Learning Network. Okay, so today it's going to be very fast. Usually to do this sort of training, it will take a couple of weeks. We're going to try and fit it all into an hour and a half with questions today. We're already 20 minutes in. Basically, we're going to, as I said, follow the Battler guide. So we're going to look at what a priority site is and what sort of characteristics they usually have. Look at invasive species and how to manage them at a site level. Invasive plants, invasive rodents, and also a few other invasive species which are commonly found around the Pacific and have large impacts on biodiversity. And we're going to have a little look at reintroducing ecosystem components. So hopefully everyone can manage to download the Battler guide. Okay, priority sites and characteristics. A big difference between managing single species and lots of species, and also species which have just arrived and ones that have been established for some time. If you look at the graph up here, you can see that when something first arrives, there's a chance to actually get rid of it, eradicate it. But the longer it stays and the more it expands, the more widespread it becomes. And it's not likely that you're going to be able to get rid of the species over the whole area. So that's when we move into either using weed biocontrol for weeds, if it's possible, or we choose valuable sites and focus on those. This is a site which has been very successful since about 2014 in Tonga. It's a mountain called Mount Talau, and they've been managing the forest on the top of that mountain since then. They have a couple of highly important species. There's the hinga or Tongan whistler, which is endemic to Vava'u, and also this beautiful plant, which only has a scientific name, but it's the only place it's found in the world. And there's only 16 stems when we started this project. It's got a very strong following from the community. It's a very important place. It has a local NGO, Va'u Environmental Protection Alliance, and they do a really good job of working with the community to keep this site maintained. They've been managing the weeds, they've been controlling the rats and the pigs. So what is a priority site? Generally, they're a representative of a relatively intact ecosystem. They usually contain endangered or threatened species, particularly those that are only found in the area. They're also areas that rely on natural infrastructure for the supply of ecosystem services to communities. They might be sites of cultural significance or provide an opportunity for education or ecotourism. So significant sites for a particular purpose. You wouldn't want to try and do this everywhere. So probably the first thing to do about your site is, try and confirm why it is a priority. Why is it important? How big it is. That determines a lot on what you can do. Whether it has good access. Obviously, it's going to be an ongoing project. So if the access is difficult, it's going to be a lot harder. And whether there are local interest groups or community groups that are going to be willing to not only assist, but also drive the project forward. On Mount Talau, there's values obviously of endemic birds and plants. The ownership is a Tongan government, so it's relatively easy to get things done. It's only a small site, 7 hectares. There's a lot of local interest and it's very close to town. It's got roads and tracks. Okay, so now we're going to look at invasive species and how to manage them. Have a think about what invasive species are impacting on your priority site. It could be a lot of different things. There's all different types of plants. There's all different types of animals, insects. These are some common ones around the Pacific. We've got African tulip, Singapore daisy, rattan palm, taro vine, rats, cats, pigs, multitude of different types of ants. And how we go about it is basically we layer the different management regimes for different taxa over a site. And then what that allows us to do is to try and keep everything simple and organized. For example, if you look at the picture there, we've got rat bait stations lined up along the boundaries of our management units. Everything's organised so it's easy to find on the ground, and everything's named and numbered so any data can be attached or attributed to those entities on the ground. So we really want to think about what sort of taxa you want to manage at your site, whether it's weeds, rodents, cats, pigs, ants, or birds. So starting off with weeds, managing invasive plants within your site. We have a forest restoration framework which we've utilised to achieve this over quite a long time, probably since the 90s, I think, 90s, early 2000s. So we really want to think about what are the species that are impacting your sites. There's lots of definition of invasive plants or weeds, whatever. But the ones that you really want to think about are what people call invasive transformers. And those are ones that change the character, the condition, form, or the nature of ecosystems over a substantial area. So we're not really talking about small weeds that don't impact on the ecosystem. We're looking about ones that actually produce massive change. There's a manual control, which most people are familiar with, which is just cutting it down. That is good for a small number of species. Some species, such as the loper tree here, it's effective if it's in a shady area, but if it's in a high light area, you're likely to get regrowths. There's spraying smaller plants or herbaceous plants with foliar spray, herbicide. You can apply herbicide as a cut stump method, or applying it around the base of the tree after cutting into the tree. You can manage the environment, which not a lot of people think about, but if plants are, particularly if they're susceptible to high shade, there's quite a few plants that require direct sunlight or high levels of sunlight. So you can actually manage the environment around them to try and create that darker environment to stop them from germinating and then just taking out the old plants, such as here in American Samoa in this picture with the tamalingi. Or you can introduce natural enemies. And this is an example down here of a natural enemy, which is lowering the impact of African tulip in a few countries in the Pacific. It won't get rid of the plant, but it will reduce its spread by reducing the ability of the young plants to grow and produce. So those are pretty much the options that we're tied with. I had a little bit of an insight to a few plants that some of you were dealing with. So we've picked out a few to look at some of those control options. The first one was tamalingi. There's been quite a lot done with manual control. It's quite time consuming, but it can be done. Again, managing the environment is quite a good one. So long as there's not a fire that burns down the forest, or a cyclone comes and destroys the forest and opens up light gaps, then you'll probably be fine with that. If that does happen, you'll get a lot of seedlings. So the key is to keep the canopy complete and healthy. Just about any herbicide will control tamalingi, even glyphosate, and it'll just make it a lot faster than using manual control. Natural enemies, there is natural enemies being developed for this in Hawaii, and one of the projects we have at the moment is trying to expand that and get it closer towards having something that can be used around the Pacific. Maremia vine, again, mostly it's manual control. It's very time consuming. It does require sunlight. It will grow in a thick forest, particularly if it can get up to the treetops, but it certainly prefers high sunlight, which is evidenced following cyclones. You can control it with glyphosate, but again, that's quite slow, or with a foliar spray. Been trying to develop a natural enemy for Maremia for some time. One of the issues is trying to determine whether it's native or invasive throughout the Pacific, and there's a lot of work going on to determine that. And a lot of these instances, it may be what we call a neo-native plant, which is a native plant, but due to ways that humans have impacted the landscape or the environment, it's become a lot more aggressive and harder to manage and a lot more widespread. One thing that people are not aware of, a lot of people are not aware of in the Pacific, is there's another plant that is often mistaken for Maremia. And down the bottom of the slide there is it's called the air potato. The best way to tell the difference is with the air potato, the stem comes out and joins the leaf right at the edge of the plant, whereas Maremia, the stem joins the leaf in the middle of the plant, not on the edge. So everyone who's got Maremia, you should check that first before you go too much further. There is a natural enemy available for air potato. African tulip. It's a large problem in a lot of countries. As I said earlier, there is two natural enemies now, which are slowly being used around the Pacific, in the Cook Islands and Vanuatu. The mite looks to be effective, and there's a flea beetle which will be joining that too. Unfortunately, African tulip isn't well controlled, just manually. It does require herbicides, primarily as a cut stump application. Glyphosate is not very effective, so we need to step that up to the next level. Triclopyr is the one that is most commonly used around the Pacific to manage African tulip. So just like if you were controlling one weed, there's a process that you need to go in. I mean, if you just go and kill one plant, it doesn't mean that you've solved the problem. If you look in the Battler Guide for managing low incidence priority weeds, you'll see there's a table to work out what's the best approach to take, whether it's a weed-led program, you're trying to manage a weed, single weed and get rid of it, eradicate it, which is what this process down the right-hand corner is all about. Or if you follow the chart, you'll see that if it's widespread, then it's best to manage it as within your restoration sites. But a lot of the principles still apply. Obviously, accuracy is a very important thing, particularly positively identifying the plant that you're trying to control. You need to be persistent. You can't just go there one day, wave the machete around and expect it to go away. And it needs to be done with timeliness in mind. And if you look at the diagram on the right, you'll see that you go through an initial control phase where you first treat the weed. You may need to follow that up with a foliar spray depending on the type of plant that it is. And that's got rid of all the plants above the ground. Then you need to continually manage the seed in the soil until that seed bank is exhausted. And then you may reach eradication. That's the basic timeline for eradicating a weed. And in that instance, it's quite particular. There's a lot of things you need to think about, such as where it is, how it disperses, the time it takes to mature so that you can get back there in time before it sets seeds again, how long the seed viability is, so you know how often you have to go back and check the site before the seeds are all gone. Positive and negative environmental conditions, like we talked about, sunlight levels, etc., etc. And you need to collect a lot of information about each site, such as the size of the coverage, so you can see whether or not each site is diminishing in size, when it was done, its age class, etc., etc. So, but if you try and do that approach in a in a particular site and it's full of weeds, it just becomes impossible. You can't manage all those sites. And what is a site? It might stretch from one side to the other. So eventually it's just too much and you'd probably just give up. So what we try and do is look at it as a more of a holistic view. We take our site and we break it down into phases of restoration that relates to application methods, the herbicides that we use, and the species that we're trying to kill or manage. So if you look at the framework which is focused on a particular weed species on the left, and then look at the one on the right there, you can see that there's two different objectives at the end of the process. For a priority weed, it's trying to eradicate it. For a restoration site or a site-led program, it's trying to look after the site. It doesn't really matter if there's weeds outside the site. We're trying to protect what's in the site. So we're just trying to manage that. And that's a big difference. So if you're looking at a practical perspective, you can see on up in this corner, there's a whole bunch of weeds. That would be, you know, that site is really ready for initial control. Once that's been done, you follow up control, spraying with the foliar herbicide on those plants that require it, and then you just manage a scene like this where you've got seeds of weeds coming up. This area here, it was already in forest protection. There's not a lot of weeds in there. There's no communities of weeds. It's just a matter of stopping that from happening. So we classify them. We'll get into that. And as time goes on, the forest regenerates, and that's what you end up protecting. And it's hard with that thing up there, right? Anyway, so the first step is to go and look at your site. We go back to the framework. What we're really looking to do is looking at areas which are either at an initial control, so the areas which contain communities of mature plants. You know, what are those plants? What are the plants we're dealing with? You're looking for areas that might go straight into protection, which is areas that contain no communities of mature plants. They might just need to be searched through to control young seedlings that have just arrived there, have been spread by birds or something like that. Or areas of long-term that are going to require long-term control. So if you removed all the weeds, if there's that many weeds here, you remove them all in the, for example, might be a stream bank or something, there would be significant impacts on the site from removing those weeds. The second step is to classify your site, the whole site, every inch of it, into those three phases. So again, you're looking for areas that have got a lot of weeds, they're mature, there's communities of weeds that are going to have to be managed, there's areas that have got relatively nothing and nothing, no communities of weeds, just isolated ones that have come in, and long-term areas. The third step is to take those phased mapped areas and develop management units within them. So as you can see from the picture there, this is in Tonga. Every inch of that reserve is part of a management unit. And the reason why we do that is because it makes it so much easier to manage. If you go into an area and just start killing weeds, you're probably not going to be successful. You need to be very targeted and thorough, and this allows you to do that. It allows you to store all the information related to those management units against them. So it provides you with a lot of information in the future to help you out. We find that generally about 1 hectare is a good size if it's full of weeds. there's no real fixed rule, but what you want to think about is the first time when you go in to do initial control, it's going to take quite a long time. And after that process, it's going to be a lot less work. So you generally want to try and work on something that's going to be maybe a week's work initially, and that might end up being a day. So there's no fixed rules, but something that's manageable, that the team on the ground can feel like they've gone and achieved doing something, finishing a management unit before moving on to the next one. It's good to use any forest edges, tracks, natural features such as streams, ridges, any changes in vegetation as boundaries where possible, because they'll really help you to determine where they are when you're on the ground, as well as the flagging tape that you're going to use to mark them out. So once you've done that, you end up with a map basically with management units on it, and also what phase those are in. So basically it'll give you a work plan for each management unit. You'll know how big it is, and you'll be able to align related data such as, you know, what species were controlled, what herbicides were used, and how much herbicides, and also labor hours, those types of things. So now we've got our site, we've got our restoration phases, we've got our management units. We're going to have to go and do something. So to do something, we have to have a method, an application method. So what application methods are best used for each type of restoration phase? Initial control is the first phase. It's basically systematic manual removal or cut stump herbicide application of all woody species present in the area. And remembering we're doing a whole management unit at a time. So you can see down the bottom picture, there's a whole lot of woody vegetation that's all been piled up. There's a whole lot of attributes with that, such as what the current state definition is, what are the key skills, equipment, how long it should take, and the benefits. Along with initial control is also the systematic cutting of all the vines. You don't want to be controlling vines up in the forest, otherwise you're going to cause a lot of damage. All you need to do is cut them at about head height. And you just remove the bits on the ground away from desirable vegetation so that they're easy to foliar spray. So you're trying to isolate the weed away from the native vegetation, so you don't want to kill it. You're trying to minimize the target that you have to spray, and you put it somewhere where it's easy to access, still connected to the ground. Follow-up control is really foliar spraying those things that you've cut, or other herbaceous plants which were not cut stump treated. And again, you just go through each management unit at a time once you've done the initial control. Then you've got to manage each of those sites for seeds germinating. You need to keep doing that until the seed viability of the longest viable seed of the plants that you're killing has expired. So it's usually about 4 or 5 years, or if they're reliant on sunlight, until the canopy closes and stops them from germinating, sorry. And then you reach forest protection stage. So everything's dead above ground. All the invasive plants, the seed banks are all exhausted. You're really just searching for new arrivals, new incursions into the area. And again, just working through each management unit at a time. Then there's the long-term control. You really want to think about this. As I said, if areas are so full of weeds, they're unstable. What you want to do is gradually remove them over time. Once there's enough regenerating native plants to maintain slope stability, or maintain some sort of structural habitat for birds and other fauna which is basically canopy management, because these are functional attributes that invasive plants can provide, and we don't want to take them all out at once if it's going to have a negative impact on the ecosystem. So next we're going to very briefly go over herbicides. Which ones, how you decide which herbicide to use. You've seen this picture before. So when you're doing any sort of work in any field for that matter, you really need to determine an effective method. Otherwise, if you go and do something and it doesn't work, you've just wasted your time. So it's a very important consideration. And you need to operationalize it in a systematic way. So it's done the same. It's done consistently by often many different people. And then you know that you've been thorough. And you're most likely going to need herbicides to achieve this. There's a few plants, I would say maybe at the most 5% of all the weeds that I've dealt with in my lifetime have been able to be killed without the use of herbicides. But herbicides have been around for a long time. The hazards are well defined, particularly if you look at countries where they're regulated under the HAZNO system. And it's relatively easy to reduce the hazard exposure by using the right equipment. And if you choose the right herbicides, then the amount of equipment and the hazards can be minimized. And that's a key point. What we do in a restoration site, because we're not targeting just one species, what we want to do is we want to move through a management unit and not go through it once for every type of weed that's there. What we want to do is compile our weeds into groups which we can manage with one methodology if we can, because then you only have to do it once. And what we try and do is we try and find the lowest common rate that will be effective on a suite of weeds. And it's not actually that hard once you've done it for a long time. There's certain types of plants that respond to different herbicides. We're not going to get in too much more into that today, but that's just the basics behind it. And if you follow the system, then you'll see that over time, there's a dramatic reduction in the amount of herbicide that's required until it's virtually nothing. People say, oh, we don't want to, use herbicides all the time. Well, in fact, if you do it properly the first time and a little time after that, then, you're not going to be using much herbicides at all. And this has been the case in, many projects, thousands of projects over 20 or 30 years that I've been involved in. It is really important to do it properly, and then you'll reap the benefits of doing that. If you don't, then it just becomes a revolving dog chasing his tail. Okay, searching for weeds is a very important thing. If you're not searching properly, things are going to be missed. If you miss one plant, which is seeding wildly, well, that's added another year at least to your program. So you want to make sure that people on the team can identify the plants correctly and that they're searching thoroughly as a team. This is what it looks like. This is quite a very dense weed infestation, and you can see how close they are to each other just to be able to move forward. In initial control, you'll find that you really need to cover the whole area. One way you can check that is with track logs. As you can see from these pictures, it's a very systematic way of moving through the forest and searching. You can tell a lot of things from track logs. You can see down in this area here, there's obviously a lot of weeds there, as people are all over the show controlling a lot of weeds, whereas up here, it's probably not so many. They've managed to stretch out quite wide as a team and cover everything, whereas In here, which is a stream area, there was obviously a lot more. When you're doing forest protection areas, it's really important to go to areas where you expect to find weeds. And one of the main places you'll find weeds is under large fruiting trees, because birds go there to eat, to rest, to roost, and that's where they generally sit and discard all the weed seeds that they've eaten. So as well as those types of trees, there's also streams and track edges, etc. All those areas where you expect weeds to come into the forest. I'm going to go very quickly over this. It's just a reiteration of what I said earlier. All the information regarding the control operations can be linked to the management units for recording and reporting. It's really good to have photo points, so you can show over time how things has changed. This is before no weed control was done. And this is now in seed bank control. You see pictures paint 1,000 words. These are really good to get people on board. And all that information can be used to show how successful the operation is going, how the number of hectares is extending, following their progression from initial control into forest protection. As I showed before, you can show reduction in herbicide. You can also look at relative weed density, herbicide volumes, all those types of things that you might find interesting. And obviously over time, if you're managing weeds, you'd expect to see a lower number of weed species in the reserve over time. And you can stretch that right out to multiple sites or even the Pacific. So we're going to crack on now because we're getting low on time. So rodents are really important to manage. I'm really glad that a lot of people mentioned that earlier in the questionnaire. They impact everything on islands, and not just on islands, also in the coastal area, including coral reefs, fish stocks, everything. So if you can get rid of rats, you're making a big improvement to that ecosystem, and particularly for the forest as well. They've been managing rats on Mount Talau since 2014 for these specific species. It's fairly straightforward to do. Basically, you import the boundary into a map and the infrastructure. So this is the track. You want to use your tracks, everything you've got to make the job easier. Just create the grid, align it with tracks, and then check the coverage. So each bait station will cover a certain distance from where the station is. Then each one is given a unique ID. So everything you record, including the bait that you put in, the bait that's left over, etc., you know exactly where that's happening. So you can modify your plan as time goes on. You might not want to have baits in all your stations, and what you can do is remove the bait from the internal ones and just use traps after a while once you've got lowered the numbers right down. Bait stations, they're installed at each point, and basically they only need to be maintained monthly after the first month, once they're knocked down. We'll skip that video. It's just how to set it up. On Mount Talau, just over 1 year, there was a significant increase in bird species, and particularly the henginger, which is the one that we were trying to protect. Now these hengingers are all over. There's a lot more. They're down on people's properties. They're expanding their range. These are birds that the local community hadn't seen for decades, so now they hear them in their back garden. So even on a small site like that, it can make a big difference. Obviously, you can set these up around your country, and it allows birds a safe place to nest, to move, to distribute across the broader landscape. And it can be done in any size area. Managing other species, cats, basically you need to decide whether you're going to live capture traps or whether you're going to use kill traps. Live capture can be difficult, particularly in this day and age. They'll probably need to be euthanized, whereas a kill trap, you don't have to deal with that. The benefits of using a cage trap is if it's someone's cat, you can give it back to them. If it's in a kill trap, you probably don't want to. But they pretty much just get set up along main tracks and highways is what cats generally use. Pigs cause a lot of damage. On Mount Talau, we originally put just a small local tongan fence around the endemic plant. Just this year, we've installed a fence around most of the top of that site now to keep the pigs out. So we've excluded the pigs from that particular site. Other ways is by catching them in cage traps or by hunting. Got a great video to show you there of the first pig being hunted on Niue, but we probably don't have time for that. Ants are a lot harder to manage. They have much smaller areas where they move. So rats and cats and things like that, you can pretty much get them to come to you. But ants, because they don't move so much, that you need a lot tighter grid. They can be managed relatively successful. It's much harder to eradicate them. A great place to go for information on ants is the Pacific Invasive Ant Toolkit. The link is there. And it's got all the tools you need for different species of ants and what you want to achieve with them. Reintroducing ecosystem structure and components. So this is really, once you've done the invasive species management work, sometimes you can improve habitat shape and structure. It's best not to have to plant. Obviously, ecosystems are well and truly capable of regenerating themselves. But sometimes you might want to do that either to speed it up, or if there's not much seed left being distributed around because of rats or cats, birds have been taken out. But you can improve the shape. So if you have a really irregular shape reserve, there's a lot of boundary for invasives to come in. You can smooth those out by doing infill planting. Ideally with colonizers, you really want forests to repopulate that area with its own plants. You really just want to create an environment for that to happen. And there may be species that have gone locally extinct, which you might want to reintroduce. So you need a good nursery, particularly in the Pacific with cyclones. And using the community is a great way to get community buy-in and also raise awareness of what you're doing. So aside from the restoration side of planting, it's also a highly valuable awareness tool. In my mind, planting is generally more expensive than saving existing regenerating forests from existing weeds. It takes a lot of effort to grow a forest from scratch. It is a lot easier to manage weeds in a forest and help it to restore itself. Here's an example of a well-maintained planting site. You can see there's no weeds. The weeds were managed over multiple years, and that's given this planting a great opportunity to get ahead. Once you've restored your site, it provides an opportunity for some of your threatened species. Obviously providing them with a safe home has got to be one of your ultimate goals. Sometimes that can involve reintroducing species that have become locally extinct, which is always something to aim for.